So I've one friend who's literally never taken a painkiller in their life. Not because they've never experienced pain, but I think because they're so afraid of the potential side effects. I have another friend who seems to be taking, too many every day and has done so for years. And I think a lot of people probably watching this are in between, but it did bring up the question in me is, how bad are painkillers actually? Which ones are worse than others? Under which circumstances is it a good idea to take them? Under which circumstances is it not? This also got stirred up because recently there was, controversy in the news where Tylenol was accused of, potentially leading to birth defects in children where the mother was taking Tylenol while pregnant. And this was, I think, quite shocking to some people because some people pop Tylenol like candy. Because it genuinely has the reputation of being the safest. And so I wanted to investigate it, look at it from a non-dogmatic, non-biased, non-mainstream, but also non-alternative perspective, and just try and dig into the facts about painkillers. This is also quite personal to me because I've not used painkillers hardly at all throughout my life. It just seemed like admitting defeat. I think that's what it was to me, as opposed to being terrified of the side effects. But recently, I admitted, I think, in recent episodes that I had a dry socket after having a root canal removed, and it was really painful. And I did take a bunch of painkillers for a while. And so I want to talk about that. And I've had many experiences over the last 10 years where I've had pain and no painkillers were effective. So I want to talk about all of this in relation to painkillers. Are they a good idea? How do they work? Is it a good idea to even avoid the signal of pain? All that kind of stuff.
Hello and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co-host, Elwyn Robinson, the creator and founder of Advanced Health Genetics, the Hormetics Weight Optimization System, and the author of the Rejuvenate Blueprint, which is the 7 root causes of all chronic diseases. And today, as you just heard, Elwyn, we are discussing painkillers. So this may bring up some questions for you. You guys may have your own experiences. So please, if you are listening, make sure you do put your comments below and questions because we will get to those. So Elwyn, you just briefly said, you had your own experience with painkillers recently, but in the past, they really hadn't been part of your life. So I'm glad you're bringing this episode because people do think, like you just said, some people have that idea that some of these painkillers are completely safe and they're popping them like candy. Why do you think that is?
I think that's often the impression that they're given by medical professionals, honestly. And, there's even this idea of, well, take it just in case you need it, take it to reduce inflammation, even if you're not in pain. It's perfectly safe. And so I wanted to investigate like why they think that and if they're right and what the counter argument is. It is true that the percentage of people who have, an acute medical incident as a result, per pill popped, is very low. Because as we just said, there's a vast amount of people using a vast amount of pills, and the amount of hospitalizations are higher than most people think. But the percentage, this is what I kind of wanted to get to. I think I have some friends who kind of feel like that if they take one painkiller, there's like a 50% chance they'll end up in hospital. And like, that's not true. But on the other hand, there's other people who feel like, oh, as long as I stick to the label, as long as I only take, a maximum of whatever it says, 6 to 8 tablets a day, I can just carry on doing that all, every day indefinitely. And that's absolutely fine and no problem. And that's not quite true either.
Right. Okay. Yeah. From, the culture in my family is like, oh, just take a Tylenol. It's fine. Take a Tylenol. If you've got a fever, take a Tylenol. It really was considered that was the go-to medicine. But as I've gotten older and throughout my own education and things, I've realized some of those things, they're not as, I don't want to necessarily say safe, but they should be treated with caution and not used so readily. let's say.
Maybe innocuous would be a word for it, right? Yeah,
Yes.
it's people treat it as if it's nothing, it's no big deal. And to be fair, I mean, we've talked about all. If people are like, oh, you're picking, like we've talked about how vitamin D3 may not be innocuous, or how copper may not be innocuous. We're not only picking on pharmaceuticals here, but we felt it was the turn of pharmaceuticals to get some scrutiny about whether they are really as safe and innocuous as they're often presented to be. I think there may be a practical element to this. This is not something I've read or seen anyone else saying. This is just like my observation from first principles. That if you are a medical professional, even a nurse, working in a clinic, I don't know what all the titles are these days, but anyone who is in that kind of mainstream, official medical framework, people are just less bothersome when they are not in pain, and so there's like a just give them this to shut them up. And I'm not saying that they're saying that because they like irrespective of the harm caused, but I just think this is the way that human brains work. It's like cognitive bias. A lot of the time, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of authority, even talking about pushing the perspective of both sides of an argument. And so when that is the case, as it often is these days with the internet, we have access to all of this information, we'll just pick the side that's more convenient to us. And so I do think there is a certain amount of that. Now, not always, and there's definitely exceptions. And, I know in the UK, for instance, they're pretty liberal still with Tylenol and ibuprofen, but that's it. Like they're absolutely very resistant and reluctant to giving any other painkillers. And in my experience, just medications in general. Whereas most other countries I visited, certainly the US, but even, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, just, giving real world examples. So I'm not picking on anyone out anywhere I haven't actually been. They're quite happy to just, oh, okay, well, if that isn't working, have some tramadol, have some Xanax, have some, whatever. Like they're much more happy to just, or have some have several broad spectrum antibiotics, just like whatever, like handing out medication, even if it's maybe not strictly 100% definitely necessary, just to kind of appease the patient or the client. And as you said, it actually goes beyond appeasing. It's actually like maybe they'll be back in again in the next day, like using up valuable resources when really all they have is this minor thing. And so if I just get them to take painkillers, then they're not going to come back and bother us about this thing that really is no big deal, and we've got more serious things to worry about. Like there may be a certain element of that. But yeah, as I said, this is my theory based on observation. There's certainly no studies proving that's why they do it.
Perfect. Well, I love it when you have your theories and we get to get in, really dig down deep. And also too, because what you do is you present both sides. That is it's a fair point with what you do and what you always try to present here for our lovely listeners who join, to get that information so that they can be empowered. So tell us about your theory. Let's dive in.
Well, okay, let's talk generally about pain for a second before we get to painkillers. And, I guess why I had the attitude of not taking painkillers. I wouldn't say there's different personality types, and one of them is the endurer, and they kind of, they like to get credit for withstanding and enduring suffering. And that's actually not like my central type. So I think it was more that I was ignoring it. Like this is not something that I have to do something about, kind of thing. Like it will go away on its own. And from the age of 19, where I had a bit of a mental episode, I kind of strongly believed in the power of the mind and the power of you can create your own reality and stuff like that. And so I just believed that I could kind of will my pain away. And then I guess before the age of 19, before the age of 18, I was living with my parents, and they were kind of quite, organic and not pharmaceutical, not medicinal kind of based. And so it just wasn't offered to me. It wasn't ever an option like on the table. So I think that's, collectively why throughout my life, I haven't really used them very often. But, to some degree, and there's been such different situations. So the other time I've had a tooth extraction, the other root canal, a couple of years ago, I tried taking painkillers because it was extremely painful, dry socket both times is just very painful. Some people say it's the worst pain. I'm sure that's not true, but it's pretty bad. And it lasts a long time, and it's constant, and it's in your head, and it's not great. And none of the painkillers that were available to me worked. And there was only one, like Hannah, my wife, had this extra strong Eastern European painkiller that she offered me. And I took it, and it was kind of effective, but only for like a few hours, 2, 3, 4 hours. And it made my heart race like over 100 beats per minute. And I was like, oh, this is just not worth it. I kind of feel like I'm dying, even though I'm not in pain briefly. It's like my heart's racing. So I ended up just not taking painkillers, doing some other stuff that maybe we'll talk about later instead, and just kind of suffering through it for a month. It was just a month of constant, sharp, severe, acute pain. Maybe more like 3 weeks of acute, and then another week of dull throbbing. And so pain's an interesting. I actually want to talk about the philosophy of pain for a second. So one of the things that's interesting is there is a very small percentage of people who are born with specific SNPs, specific genetic variations, that means that they don't feel pain. And what's interesting about those people is that it's called CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain and anhidrosis syndrome. I think it used to have a different name. I can't remember what it is. But basically, the interesting thing about it to me is they don't feel any pain of any kind. And they rarely live over the age of 30.
I was going to say that could be very dangerous.
100%. So, different people, different things are like the bane of their life. I would say, to me, despite what I just said about ignoring it and willing it away and stuff, pain is it. Like fear, I feel like, is all in the mind, and I can overcome it usually. And, sadness, like there's a lot of things that I feel like I don't have to be prey to or victim of. But physical pain isn't one of them. It's like one of those things that, some people, they're very good at dissociating and just not being in their body and not feeling it. There's even training for that, like Navy SEAL training, all that kind of thing. Some people get very, very good at not being able to withstand torture, all this kind of thing. Like some people get very good at not feeling physical pain. I'd say I'm not one of them. And so, out of all the different types of suffering, I suppose you could call it, that human beings experience, the one that I least enjoy and would most want to avoid is physical pain. I think for most people, it's up there, right? It's in the top 3 for a lot of people, if not maybe the number one thing. For some people, the absolute worst feeling is shame, and for some people, the absolute worst feeling is, terror or sadness, despair, whatever. It's up there. And so it's very easy to see it as just a bad thing that we want to avoid, right? But it's very important to remember that it does serve a purpose. And I think that there needs to be nuance in this, because people tend to see either too much one way or too much the other. Either they're like, kind of, as I say, like Spartan, Puritan, enduring, and it's like, pain is good for me, I'm not going to avoid it, pain helps me learn, pain helps me grow, and all the rest of it, which there is truth to that philosophy. But the challenge is pain is also very dysregulating to, every system of the body. And if it happens for a short period of time, it's the body recovers, it's no big deal. But especially if it goes on for a long period of time, like chronic pain, either because, you've broken a leg or an arm and it just takes months, a couple of months to heal, or, maybe you've got chronic pain like arthritis or whatever, and it's something you've had for years, decades. It really dysregulates a lot of things, but from my point of view, most importantly, the central nervous system and the endocrine system. And it gets you to a place where you can't sleep properly. You are overly in a fight or flight state, or you may have a tendency to dissociate. And so it really potentially negatively impacts the quality of your life. The ability to be creative, the ability to be curious, the ability to connect with others, the ability to be passionate and enthusiastic about something, or the ability to, rest and recover, the ability to enjoy life, anhedonia, on and on and on. All of these things can be profoundly impacted if you experience too much pain too much of the time. So that's the kind of anti-pain argument. The pro-pain argument is, what I just said, the extreme. People who don't feel pain often don't even survive much past adulthood because it's so important. But what about the more subtle version of it? I really think that pain is necessary for emotional growth. And I think pain is really necessary for the development of virtues and what you might call spiritual or religious growth, depending on, how you look at things. I think pain is very necessary for compassion, which, I guess you could say is one of those virtues, but one of them that I would pick on. And so when I see someone who chronically avoids pain, and when I say chronically avoids pain, maybe it's popping loads of paracetamol every day, maybe it's using cannabis all day, every day. That's what I did between the ages of 15 and 28. Maybe it's drinking alcohol all day, every day. Maybe it's using opiates all day, every day. Any of those things and more. And let's say all day, every day, I'm only slightly exaggerating, but basically, if you're using any of the substances I just said half the time, 3 or 4 days a week, it's still not great health-wise, but it's not really in the category I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the kind of person that pathologically avoids any kind of pain, whether it's physical pain or probably even more primarily emotional pain. When you are consistently avoiding pain, what you're also avoiding is learning the lesson that pain would have taught you. And so, and when I say emotional immaturity, I mean, let's say if you're rude to someone, they are rude back to you, and then that hurts your feelings. Now, if you just allow the hurt feelings to exist inside you, a lesson will hopefully probably form, maybe not the first time, but eventually, sooner or later, if I hurt people, there's a good chance they'll hurt me back. Sometimes more than I hurt them. And so maybe it would be a good idea for me to not hurt people, or at least do it less. Maybe only do it sometimes if it's appropriate for some very specific reason, but certainly not as a habit of way of walking through life, or just because I feel like it. But so many people are robbing themselves of that important lesson because every time they feel pain, they take something. Whether it's an opiate, whether it's cannabis. And I'm going to talk about the positive benefits of cannabinoids, by the way, later when it comes to, painkillers. So I don't think I'm picking on it, but this is the downside of it to me. Because I know people who like cannabis a lot are very defensive of it. This is the downside of alcohol. This is the downside of, and all the other more obscure things I won't mention, but which, we could talk about. The primary downside to me is if you don't feel the pain, you often don't feel the consequences of your actions. If you try and do something and you fail at it, that's painful. But sometimes there's a lesson to be learned. Maybe you did it wrong. Maybe it was the wrong thing to try and do, whatever. Or so that's, again, something to learn. And then, sometimes you just have to learn a lesson. You're not always going to be successful at everything. Sometimes you're going to do things and they're going to fail, whether it's, reaching out to someone that you're attracted to, or trying to start a business and making money, or trying to get a job that you think you'd really enjoy, or trying to start a creative project that you think would fulfill you, whatever it might be. It may not work. You may fail. And so when you get into this habit of avoiding pain, you may be avoiding pain by just not even trying, not doing any of the kind of things that I just listed, or you may do it by taking substances. But to me, after you try them, but to me, it's kind of the same thing. They're heavily correlated together. The people who are most successful in all dimensions, I realize there are some people who might be very successful in their career who, take painkillers all the time. But you'll find in many cases that they're often really suffering in some other, really important primary dimension of their life. And so I think, the excessive avoidance, let's put it beyond just excessive, the compulsive and habitual avoidance of pain is a sign of emotional immaturity. I personally would say that I did not mature emotionally at all between the ages of 14 and 28 because I was constantly, it was mainly cannabis, but it was also alcohol. I was constantly numbing my emotions. And so I was just in this kind of haze. And I was clear, when I would break out of it, I was like, wow, okay, like I'm having to try stuff again, face rejection, face failure, face, being embarrassed, all these kind of things that, just weren't part of my life. And I also stagnated during that time between 15 and 28. I hardly did anything. So I know I'm sharing a lot of personal stuff, but I'm doing this. Hopefully some people can, relate to it. And if I reach even just one person who still is doing this, who realizes, oh, I need to stop, then this recording will have been more than worth it, because this is a really big deal. Um, pain is an excellent teacher. Gurdjieff, who we mentioned, a philosopher and esotericist from a few episodes ago, we talked about in that episode how, from a certain perspective, and maybe we'll do a sequel for this where we go through the science of it, we didn't get to it, but from a certain perspective, a lot of people are moving through life in a very robotic, reactionary way. Kind of the modern parlance, I guess, would be, calling people NPCs, non-player characters, where people are very, they don't really have initiative and curiosity and like awareness and all the rest of it. They're just kind of going through the motions. Well, a lot of spiritual systems and religious systems talk about how pain is the thing that breaks you out of it. And this is why some of them, they do it voluntarily, Dan Brown Dan Brown novels about the Christian sect that was whipping themselves every day and all of this kind of stuff. But it's not just them, the Indian, the sadhus are like drive nails through themselves, and even if it's not as extreme and mutilating as that, but like the different spiritual practices where you're sitting for a very, very long periods of time, that's like excruciating level of boredom, which is a different kind of pain to most people, or a lot of the time physical discomfort. It's actually quite difficult usually for the body to be sitting for hours and then not moving. And so all of these things, like the idea that pain can wake you up, pain can snap you out of that trance, is maybe a bit more advanced version of what I was just saying about emotional maturity. At the very least, it can help you operate more in the world if you don't block the feeling of pain all the time, emotional and physical pain. But maybe at the the highest levels, it actually allows you to really excel beyond where most human beings are if you really embrace it. And probably a practical example of that, even from this modern age, and I realize he's not perfect, like I'm not, but Wim Hof was this person who embraced a specific type of pain, which is cold, which absolutely triggers the pain centers in the body when you expose yourself to extreme cold, like he does. And by doing so, he managed to do a bunch of things that scientists thought wasn't possible while being scientifically documented. So that's an example of kind of going beyond what the understanding was of what human beings are capable of by embracing pain. That was really, and I know he talks about breathing practice as well, but I listened to his autobiography book thing, and it was embracing the pain of cold that was the specific cornerstone of his philosophy and what he was doing initially. And it's not surprising to me that someone who is embracing pain might be someone who like proves that human beings are capable of far more than we originally thought. He may not be the first, as I think he'd be happy to admit. There's Tibetan monks and all kinds of people who've been doing it for hundreds, thousands, God knows how long of years. But it just goes to show that there is that correlation. So anything from just simple, reaching out to someone you like, or starting applying for a job that you think you might actually enjoy or something like that, all the way to breaking the limits of what human beings are supposed to be capable of, like all of them kind of require an embracing of pain. And you could call it suffering, but I'm calling it physical or emotional pain, specifically, because I guess suffering could also be mental, but I'm really focusing on physical and emotional. If you've ever typed into Google Why am I so tired all the time, even when I eat well and sleep 8 hours? Or why do I still have digestive issues when I eat cleaner and better than most people I know? Or why do I wake up every morning feeling in pain when I exercise and stretch every day? Then this is for you. I used to search for exact phrases like that at like 3 in the morning because I felt prematurely old and nothing was working. Now, here's the thing most doctors and even most functional medicine people still miss. Your symptoms are personal, so the solutions have to be personal too. And the most personal data you own is your own DNA. That's why I created Advanced Health Genetics All Access Membership. And the good thing is, if you ever did 23andMe, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, any of the big Ancestry DNA tests, you can literally upload that old raw data file that you already have access to, and within a few hours get over 500 brand new health reports that none of those ancestry companies give you. What we do is we take your raw DNA and we feed it into an advanced AI built by 65 scientists and engineers and expand it from the usual 600,000 markers to over 200 million genetic variants, which we analyze with 99.7% accuracy. Then we give you actual answers instead of just ancestry pie charts, which are interesting, but probably not life-changing. What does that mean specifically? Well, it means that you'll discover exactly which vitamins and minerals you're genetically wired to run low on. Things like magnesium, zinc, B12, folate, vitamin D, iron, omega-3s. We actually cover all the essential amino acids and essential fats too. So no more buying lots of supplements, hoping they'll make a difference. You can actually find out which ones you're most likely to actually need. You'll see your personal risk scores for the real root causes everyone's talking about these days. Things like chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, blood sugar swings, visceral fat, hardening arteries, and yes, some of the genetics that are most commonly talked about as well, like MTHFR, ApoE, and COMT. And most importantly, you'll see exactly what to do about each one with recommendations for changes of lifestyle, diet, and supplements. You'll find out why caffeine may be wrecking you, or maybe why you can drink 6 espressos and have no problem, sleep like a baby right afterwards. You'll get a full hormone and neurotransmitter profile. Which of your testosterone, cortisol, dopamine, oxytocin, estrogen, all these things are most likely to be out of balance, so you can stop wasting your money testing the wrong things. You'll even get fitness reports to find out whether you're genetically built for endurance or power, what your VO2 max potential is likely to be, your risk for tendon injury, back injury, all these kind of things, so you can finally train the way your body was actually designed. And every single recommendation, dietary changes, supplements, lifestyle tweaks, is scored from 1 to 5 on impact and evidence. So basically what that means is you know exactly where to start, what's the most important thing to do without getting overwhelmed. Try it now. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com. If you have an old DNA file, you can upload it and you have your first reports within hours. If you don't, then make sure to select the DNA kit option and we'll send you a DNA kit. You take a saliva sample. It's really easy. Advanced Health Genetics is already by far the most affordable DNA reporting company of its kind. But if you use the code REJUVENATE at checkout, that's REJUVENATE, you get an additional 20% off your order. Click the link in the description, the pinned comment, wherever you see it, or just type in your browser advancedhealthgenetics.com. Do it now while it's fresh in your mind, because the version of you 6 months from now is going to thank you for not putting this off anymore.
That's really good. I mean, you make that very good point that many of us, we do a lot to avoid that pain. But on the other side of it, there could be this absolute treasure, this absolute gift that helps wake us up from something that we in the bigger picture really don't want in our lives anymore. So sometimes it can be a bit of a leap of faith to do it. But also too, there's that other side of that deep, deep, deep physical pain that can be absolutely debilitating.
Yeah, and I think the period of time it goes on for is probably a key factor. I will, I talk about sometimes these episodes and it feels like I'm straying too far away from health. So I'll bring it back to health for a second as well. So the health challenge of it is that, let's say you have a headache and then you're like, oh, I'll take a whatever. The problem is you haven't asked yourself the question, why do I have a headache? And it may well be, I'm too tense, or it may be I'm dehydrated, or it may be, my serotonin is too high, or it may be my norepinephrine's too high, or it may be my potassium's too low, or, whatever, like my blood pressure's too high, whatever, like asking the question about why do I feel this way is really important. And you could even apply it to emotional issues. It's like, why is it so crushingly painful to try something and fail, right? Like, and maybe that's something to, do some therapy about, or do some inner, exploration about, and to realize that actually to fail is part of life, and most of the most successful people in the world fail a lot more often than they succeed, and there's no big deal about failing. It's only giving up that is shameful, all of that kind of stuff. But again, you wouldn't have any of those kind of realizations if you were just suppressing the feeling and not even allowing yourself to feel it in the first place. So allowing yourself to feel feelings is crucial. I think the challenge is more, if you know why you have it, you are actively doing everything you can, or at least you know how to resolve it, and you're having the pain anyway. So in the case with me with this tooth extraction thing, I knew I was in pain because I had this old rotten tooth pulled out of some rotten bone, probably almost certainly both infected, as we've talked about with root canals. And because it was all infected, like the clot didn't form properly, and then I had exposed bone, exposed nerves in the mouth, which is full of bacteria, food residue, no matter how often you clean it, as I was doing very frequently, all the rest of it. Like, of course it's going to be painful to some degree, and we'll talk about the exact mechanism of how that happens next, if you like. And I knew what to do. I knew, don't do this, do this. So I had a full list of recommendations what to do in that case that I was following religiously, but I was still in pain because it takes weeks to heal. And then it's like, well, okay, do I have the pain and then, have problems sleeping, feel all stressed while I'm awake because I have this, inescapable painful feeling, or do I reduce it? And it's a bit more of a judgment call in that case, I admit, especially about, how much to take and when to discontinue and all the rest of it. But it's a bit more justifiable in that case. Now, but, and what about something else? What if I have a chronic pain condition like rheumatoid arthritis? I know what it is. I know why I've got it. Maybe it's, toxic exposure, or this genetic tendency, and I've done everything I can. I'm doing everything I can. Maybe it is getting better slowly, but for now I'm suffering and I can't sleep and I'm stressed. It's like, again, is it justifiable to manage it for now? And if it is, what's the best way of doing it? So, and the argument against painkillers is that you may be wrong. So for instance, you may think why your ankle is hurting or whatever, and you may think you're doing everything that you need to, but you may be wrong. And if you say, okay, well, I know why it's hurting, I'm just going to take painkillers now and it'll go away, maybe you're wrong. And then you've taken a bunch of painkillers, maybe you have not been treating it properly and being careful with it because it wasn't as painful as it should be, and now you kind of permanently got some slight issue when you walk. You're not walking correctly anymore because you spend too long not being aware of this issue that you ignored because you're taking painkillers. So even then, even if you think you know what the cause is and what's going on, it's still potentially risky to take painkillers, but at least it's kind of justifiable. I think the least justifiable form of painkiller use, in my opinion, is I have a pain, I don't know why, but I'm just going to pop a painkiller. That's the worst, and probably I would guess more than 50% of use of painkillers is in exactly that context. And that's the thing that I want to kind of warn against the most strongly, especially if it's habitual and frequent, which is what I'm going to go through with evidence in a minute.
No, I mean, you make a very valid point, and it's that awareness that, as we said at the beginning, this isn't just an innocuous little pill. There are side effects. There are potential risks for long-term use, just so, sporadically throughout your life. So, you did also say you were going to talk about the mechanism of action. So do you want to do that?
Yeah, we'll talk about the mechanism of action of painkillers, but let's talk about the mechanism of pain to begin with. I think that's, very important. Um, okay, pain and inflammation really go hand in hand. You can have pain without inflammation, but the most popular painkillers are generally working on the inflammatory pathways. So we definitely need to understand inflammation. In fact, I said earlier that a lot of the time painkillers weren't working for the type of pain that I had the last 10 years. That's why, because it wasn't really inflammation based. But usually it is. So inflammation, I always kind of mention this. I don't know if other people find it interesting to me, but inflammation, flam as in flame, it comes from the Latin inflammare, which means to set on fire. So that's interesting. I've studied the humors and the old Western medicine and the Taoist idea of the 4 or 5 elements and stuff like that. So it's interesting that an excess of fire is basically what inflammation would be classified as in those kind of systems. And it's interesting that the word itself implies an excess of fire. Anyway, so basically it's the body's frontline defense system. It's triggered when cells detect damage or foreign invaders. And foreign invaders could be organisms, but could even be, say you step on something and, it's like a splinter and there's suddenly all these little fragments of wood and dirt and all the rest of it in your foot. Well, someone's got to take care of all that. And that would also be your immune system. So there's all kinds of different types of immune cells. There's macrophages and neutrophils. Neutrophils are often like a first line of infections, like against most infections, and they have these specialized sensors on them called toll-like receptors or TLRs, which go around kind of, and it's obviously not exactly this, but kind of reading every molecule that they come across like a barcode to try and identify what it is, and basically trying to work out should this be here or not. And so what they're specifically looking for is what's often called PAMPs, PAMPS, which stands for pathogen-associated molecular patterns, or DAMPs, damage-associated molecular patterns. So basically, again, I use the example of the splinter, but that's less common. More commonly, it's either some kind of organism or it's some kind of cell damaged, which is often related to, toxic exposure. I'd say would be the number one cause of that. And so, if the cell's injured, there might be little, fragments of DNA floating around, fragments of cell wall, fragments of mitochondria, or whatever. And it's like, oh, that shouldn't be floating around. That should be nicely contained in a cell. And so again, it sees that's the problem. We need to go in and work out what's going on there. So this activates something called NF-κB, kappa beta, which releases cytokines. Cytokines most people probably have heard of from like COVID, if nothing else. So these are the inflammatory molecules, constituents of the immune system. There's TNF alpha, you may have heard of that. Interleukin 1 beta, there's different interleukins. Some of them are more inflammatory, some of them are more regulatory, they call them. So it's kind of calming the immune system down, stopping it from being excessive. But basically, maybe all that's a bit complicated. Bottom line, seeing something that shouldn't be there, activate. Then what, right? Then the blood vessels dilate. So this is called vasodilation. Typically happens either with histamine or something called prostaglandins. And they increase blood flow by vasodilation. So it's just literally opening up so more blood can get in. That's the idea. And what that looks like, though, is redness and heat. So this is the idea of fire again. So kind of inflammation to set fire. It's really like an excess or an increase of blood flow. And this is, another example. People who take high dose fast-acting niacin, they get all red usually and feel irritated or whatever. And this is simply, it kind of feels like you're on fire when you take it, but it is basically simply vasodilation. That's what's going on. And it also, as well as dilating blood vessels, it also increases permeability, which allows the different white blood cell constituents, different immune system constituents to get into the site to flood it, which then leads to swelling. And so, redness, heat, swelling, these basic things of inflammation, and you often, although not always, pain. Now we can understand them a little bit, because the idea is it's opening up the pathway for more of the immune system constituents to get in. It's flooding it with immune system constituents, and it's also opening up the pathways for more nutrients and other stuff to be able to get in, oxygen, etc., and more bad stuff, toxins, cellular debris, used up immune system components that are now done the job and have died, etc., to get back out again. So it's basically just opening up the pathway significantly and increasing the flow. But to begin with, the flow is largely going in, because that's where the danger is, and that's where the swelling and the redness, etc., comes from. Then the different immune system constituents, especially neutrophils and macrophages, again, they phagocytose, which is like eat, swallow, engulf the debris or the pathogens, and then the prostaglandins, which we mentioned earlier, kind of amplify the response, almost like the hype men to, come on, more and more. And when it's kind of considered that the threat is over, threat of excess cell damage or excess pathogens, then the regulatory parts of the immune system start to become more dominant, usually referred to as anti-inflammatory, interleukin 10, resolvins, and then they kind of say in the signal, okay, this is dealt with now. So this is the case, twisted ankle, bee sting, some kind of contaminant, you've accidentally been injected, your cat scratches you, whatever, like this kind of basics, even someone sneezes on you, whatever, this kind of basic, all right, something's come in, we're dealing with it thing. So why does it do this? So, obviously sending the immune system constituents to deal with it, like we talked about. But also the swelling creates a physical barrier. So it's like, let's say, the bee sting or the mosquito bite or whatever example, like the reason you get the red bump is partly because it's trying to keep it there, that poison and the pathogens. It's trying to stop it spreading. So part of the overwhelming is to deal with it, but part of the overwhelming as well is to keep it localized there, to stop it spreading to the rest of the body, and especially to stop it spreading to the bloodstream itself, which is called sepsis in the case of an infection, is serious and very often life-threatening. As I said, it brings nutrients in, especially oxygen, brings waste out. And so, that's basically it. And so if it works in exactly the way I just said, that's great. It's not great, like if you've just been stung by a bee or if you just stubbed your toe or whatever, because it's painful, but it's great in the sense that everything you're experiencing, the redness, the swelling, the pain, the discomfort, it's all appropriate and has a job to do, and you actually wouldn't want to reduce it. And that's the interesting thing, going back to the point you made about just take ibuprofen or Tylenol or whatever as an anti-inflammatory precaution. And it's like, well, you don't necessarily want to reduce inflammation. That is unfortunately unpleasant, but it is a process, every bit of which serves a purpose, so long as it is in those kind of contexts that we just said, right? Something, and it doesn't even have to be an outside invasion or an outside injury. If for some, let's say you have if you consume a toxin that damages a bunch of cells, you kind of want that inflammatory response as well to clear away those damaged and debris of cells before they start causing more problems, So even in that case, it's all totally appropriate. The problem is, from a mainstream perspective, what they look at, the problem is when that response doesn't work properly. So they would say the problem is the regulatory cells of the immune system are not dominant enough. The inflammatory cells are overly dominant. Often, they blame genetic causes. or various other things. And so the problem is that it keeps going, and they often refer to this as autoimmunity or just generalized inflammation, And there's a lot about this which is very suspect. It's like Dr. Sano, who we did an episode about quite a while ago, talked about this. Like, if you injure yourself and you have inflammation 2 weeks later, that's perfectly reasonable. But the idea that you could injure yourself and then have inflammation 2 years later is ridiculous. Like, in that point, the inflammation has nothing to do with the injury anymore. Like, that injury should and does heal, way quicker than that. And if it heals, even let's say if you break something and it doesn't heal properly, okay, maybe it hasn't healed properly, but it's still healed as much as it's going to. And so that inflammatory process should still have ended ages ago. So this idea that you just have inflammation is highly suspect to me. And so, as I say, they often blame it on autoimmunity, lack of the immune system working properly. My perspective, and this is where I'd side more with the terrain theory people who we often have as guests on this show, is that it's probably actually that there is a cause that the immune system is not calming down, that it's staying inflamed, that has not been identified and resolved. An example of this that we just did a recent episode on, so I don't have to explain it all over again, would be with the cardiovascular system. The idea that the cardiovascular system is just inflamed, and so therefore we have to take anti-inflammatories and we have to take beta blockers, which or other things which increase vasodilation, and we have to take statins, which stop our bodies producing enough cholesterol, cholesterol, and all this kind of things. It's like, what if there's just something in there setting off the immune system? And sure enough, as we talked about a few episodes ago, there is now evidence. Honestly, I was hearing about this 15 years ago, but I can see now mainstream studies and evidence talking about how actually, in many cases, the cardiovascular system is not as pure and what's the word when there's no bacteria?
Sterile?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, sterile. There's a general idea that, except for an exceptional life-threatening circumstances like sepsis, the cardiovascular system is sterile. And it's not, it turns out, the case. A lot of the time there are certain bacteria there, often related to the mouth environment, the dental gum environment, and there's a heavy correlation between those bacteria being there, often admittedly hidden under layers of biofilm, which may actually be what arterial plaque is and what it's based on, that the immune system can't get to but still detects, and so stays in this inflamed state. So that's just one example of, now I think mainstream pretty much not argued by anyone who is up to date on the research, which is either the number one or number two killer in the world, where actually this persistent inflammatory state of the immune system is not because of a fault of the immune system. You could maybe say it's because the immune system is not able to deal with the infection as well as you'd want, sure, but it's not because it's like broken and not working properly, which is how it's always, and to be honest, I think in practice often usually still treated. It's because it's activated by something and it can't deal with that thing. And I believe that that is the case way more often than is actually acknowledged. And so again, not against something that reduces that inflammatory response while you're dealing with the problem, maybe, depending on a bunch of different contextual circumstances. But this attitude of, we'll just take drugs to, deal with the symptom or suppress the immune system or whatever, without actually looking at why there is something wrong. And sometimes it is just that the genetics, that the person, but honestly, I'm sure that that's the case because life is very myriad and complex and varied. But in every person I've ever gone deep with investigating what's going on with them, where they have that tendency for persistent allergies, mast cell activation, histamine, inflammation, all the rest of it, there's always something behind it. Usually not even either a toxin or an infection. Usually it's both, and completely ignored. And sometimes they've been to dozens of practitioners and experts and world leading blah, 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 blah. But because each of those experts often is a specialist and only focuses on their area, they haven't zoomed out enough to just go, all right, let's look for every possible toxin, or at least the most likely culprits. I mean, it's hard to test everything, but let's look for the most likely culprits toxins. Let's look for the most likely culprits infections. That's usually what it is. So again, I know at the beginning I did a bit of philosophy about much health, but this is where you start to see it applied to health, right? Like to just suppress the symptom, to suppress the sensation, and yes, to suppress the inflammation without looking at why it's actually there. Because I'll use myself as an example of this again. I do not have any evidence of systemic inflammation in my body. I test again and again and again. Even though I've got quite high levels of heavy metal, I do have some localized inflammation, like for instance in my gums with the root canal, sometimes in my digestive tract, sometimes in my sinuses. And despite all of those issues, I still don't have signs of systemic inflammation. So if you have signs of systemic inflammation, or even, it doesn't have to be everywhere, but, your joints or your whole cardiovascular system or whatever, your whole digestive system, it's a sign that there's a real problem. Like, it's not just, oh, let's suppress it, right? It's like there is a cause there that we need to look for and find. If you're eating clean, exercising, and your belly fat just won't shift, listen up. The number one cause for this happening is insulin resistance. It's the number one hormonal imbalance, which explains why people in their 30s, 40s, and beyond just can't lose weight. I'm Owen Robinson, and together with Dr. Miriam Mikitsky, we created the Hormetics Weight Optimization Formula. Insulin is a key part of that. More and more people every year are being diagnosed with insulin resistance. It is the number one reason why people struggle to lose weight so much. And that's why we created the Insulin Balance Formula. It's our most popular formula. It contains precisely chosen quantities of berberine, fenugreek, zinc, and folate, which are all clinically studied ingredients shown to lower insulin, kill cravings, and turn your body from a fat storer to a fat burner. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/insulin, order now, and you'll be invited to join our clinical study the moment you check out at no extra cost, so you can track exactly how well and how effectively it works for you. Use code REJUVENATE as well to get 20% off. End the blood sugar roller coaster. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/insulin and use code REJUVENATE for 20% off now.
Very well said. I mean, it's, one of my friends, bless her, she's had issues throughout her life and things, but she was really getting on top of them and doing well. And just now, within the last 6 months to a year, it is really 6 months, she suddenly got pain everywhere in every joint. And it's like, this makes so much sense, because how would the body just stop working? I mean, I think it's one of the most magical things in this universe of it heals itself. It does things so beautifully, but yet we're just told, oh, it's failing. It's just failing.
Did they blame autoimmunity, or did they not even say that?
Yeah, that's what they're saying. So they're trying, steroids and things like that. So more suppression.
I'm not even sure if autoimmunity really exists. I know I've referred to it before. It depends on the definition, of course, as often is the case. If we, define autoimmunity as your immune system attacking your own body's tissues, it absolutely exists. But if we define autoimmunity as your immune system is just attacking your body's tissues for no reason, which is the definition that I often see, as I said, I'm very skeptical of it, and I have yet to. It probably exists because, as I said, life is complex, but I certainly don't think it's the majority of the time. I think the majority of the time, you did a simple panel, look for signs of toxicity in terms of, liver function and maybe more subtle things than just liver enzymes that functional doctors would test for. Look for signs of, immune system, reacting to specific infectious things. Look for infections, ask that person, do you have skin fungus? Do you have toenail fungus? Do you have gum inflammation? Do you have digestive inflammation? Are you on PPIs? Are you taking antacids? Do you have IBS? Do you have and I bet do you have sinus issues? Do you have you frequent UTIs? And I bet somewhere along that list they're going to go, oh yeah, and between that and then the chemical exposures which you can test for, maybe pesticides, mycotoxins, heavy metals, maybe phthalates, BPA, something like that, just as a starting place. The chances that they're going to say no to and get a no clear to every one of those tests is almost nothing. The problem is that a lot of those tests, the actual tests, as opposed to just the questions, at least, are pretty expensive. And even the tests to kind of work out what's going on, like, okay, so, you have sinus issues, why? You have digestive issues, why? You have UTIs, why? All that kind of thing. They can be quite expensive. But honestly, the main reason why tests are expensive, the main reason, although there's certainly others, is like with a lot of these things, is just the more that they're done, the cheaper the cost is. It's economies of scale is like a big thing in capitalism in general. And so the reason why it costs, hardly anything to test, levels of sodium and potassium and red blood cell count and glucose levels and all the rest of it in the blood, and when I say hardly anything, I mean a few cents, literally, is because it's done so much. And the reason, the main reason why it's so expensive to test for ochratoxin A or mercury or PCBs or whatever is because it's done so little compared to how often it should be. Or even, like zinc status, I guess that's somewhere in the middle. That's if zinc is depleted, that's an early sign of both the immune system struggling and toxic exposure in many cases. That you wouldn't even have to go so far necessarily of always testing the every toxin. But yeah, again, it's just so uncommon compared to how often it should be being done. And so unfortunately, it's a vicious circle, right? It's not done because it's so expensive, and it's so expensive because it's not done. And this is kind of what we need to break out of.
Absolutely, because we are seeing these issues come more and more, common these days, even though, as you just said, they're not so common in the testing, but they are creeping up and you're hearing about it more often than not. But yet it does seem hard when somebody wants to find the answer that it is cost prohibitive to find the answer.
Yes. Oh, we should get to painkillers, right?
Yes.
Because I spent too long on the introduction, although hopefully that was helpful for people. Okay, so let's say you're in that position, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're in that position, then what would somebody do? What should they do?
So it's really context dependent. That's the thing I was surprised to discover when I was researching this. I mean, not surprised, but maybe I was surprised to the degree to which this is true. I have to admit that before I dug into it, even I had a bit too much black and white thinking about, what isn't a good idea and all the rest of it. So let's break down the different categories of painkillers. I won't talk about each individual one, although I might sometimes use one as a proxy for the group, because if it's one that people have heard of. So the categories are non-opioid analgesics, paracetamol or acetaminophen is one, Nsaids is another, NSAIDs, which stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, I forgot the last word, but non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, I guess. And it's a bit of an odd thing when a drug is classified and what it's not, especially when there's loads of other options. But anyway, that's what they're called. And there's something called metamizole, but that's rarely used, so I'm not going to go into that one. They're all in that category. Then there's opioids, of course. There's weak opioids, like codeine is the only one readily available in the UK, I know. Tramadol, seen that much more commonly in Asia. Tapentadol, I haven't seen. Tramadol, I think, is quite common in the US as well. And then there's the strong ones, morphine, oxycodone, hydromorphone, methadone, heroin, and then, of course, fentanyl at the extreme ends, which, these days when you think about fentanyl, you tend to think of, people dying of overdose with recreational drug use. But, of course, there is a medicinal application as well. My father-in-law currently is taking fentanyl patches because he's, like end stage C word, and it's recommended in certain instances because basically if nothing else works, it's and when how do you say it, like when the risk is not as primary because the person is already very far along, then often fentanyl is actually used. So yeah, everything from codeine to fentanyl or opioids. There's adjuvant analgesics. So what that means is they're not actually technically reducing pain, which is what analgesic means, but they are doing so indirectly. So the two categories of those are usually antidepressants, which are often working on serotonin and norepinephrine as well. And then there's anticonvulsants, which are usually working on GABA. In fact, the examples I've got here, gabapentin, pregabalin, so very GABA focused. And so this is because, as I said, there are different types of pain. It's not only inflammation. One of the other most common causes of pain is convulsions or spasms of the muscles. And so those type of medications are more effective for that. There's corticosteroids, which, for example, prednisone might be some that people have heard of. So this is basically cortisol and cortisol-based medications, because cortisol is an anti-inflammatory, despite the potential problems with it that we talked about in a recent episode. There's NMDA receptor antagonists. Most famous one probably is ketamine on that list. There's also others, dextromethorphan and memantine. There's cannabinoids, which we have talked about before. THC and CBD probably being the most famous, but there's some kind of drug versions as well, like nabilone. And then these days there's all kinds of other cannabinoids that have been invented, like HHC and Delta 8 and all the rest of it. There's muscle relaxants. So I know we talked about relaxing earlier with GABA, but so anticonvulsants is more working on GABA. The muscle relaxants are more working on things like sodium channels and stuff, like just stopping the muscles from literally being tense. Like cyclobenzaprine, baclofen, that's often recommended for IBS, and various others. And then there's topicals like lidocaine, capsaicin, which you might remember, have heard of, Chrissy. It's the stuff in chili peppers that burns you. And then Nsaids as well, like ibuprofen are sometimes applied topically. So yeah, I guess with that one, topicals, it's just, different mechanisms, but they're often classified in their own category. So yeah, should we talk about how they work? And then specifically what I've got here is like, what nutrients do they deplete? What organs do they potentially stress? What hormonal imbalances do they create? Stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's really great because then it helps give people an idea of, this isn't just some little pill. It does do some things. We know, it might take the pain away, but, let's really know how they work. Because as you said earlier, some pain, when you take a painkiller, it doesn't even touch the sides of it. So it'd be really great to know.
Doesn't work.
Yeah. It'd be really great to know how it works. And as like you said, especially here, as we discuss in the 7 steps, the nutrients, if they're being depleted, we might need to up those. So yes, please, let's carry on that discussion there.
Okay. Well, let's start with paracetamol or acetaminophen, which I think you Americans call Tylenol usually. It's all the same thing. And you don't mind me, I know you've lived in England a long time as well,
Yeah.
Chrissy, but I'll still refer to you as American, based purely on the accent. So, all right, how does it work? Central COX inhibition, mainly COX-2 and COX-3, which basically reduces the production of the prostaglandins, which we talked about earlier as being part of that system. The one that I found interesting, I didn't even know this until I did this research, it's actually an endocannabinoid reuptake inhibitor. Because I'd always thought of paracetamol as being purely, it's not anti-inflammatory, but still like an inflammation-based painkiller, which is why it usually wasn't effective for me, because it's usually not inflammation that I had pain from. But yeah, it turns out the endocannabinoid anandamine specifically, which comes from the word ananda, which in Hindu means bliss. So it's interesting that it actually raises or stops the breakdown of that bliss chemical that your body naturally makes. And I was like, I'm starting to understand now why some people are more addicted to it, other than the more obvious reduction in prostaglandins. That effect is not super strong, admittedly, but I can see that the combination of the two. So it's like the more mechanical reduction of inflammation plus the more perceptual increase of endocannabinoids, which it's kind of a disassociation. It's kind of like you just care less. It could be quite, compelling and effective potentially, even though neither of those are super strong with that. That is the thing about paracetamol. But nonetheless, if your pain is mild to moderate, it can be very effective. And so I can see how those mechanisms, how some people might enjoy those. So the actual, anti-inflammatory effect is not as strong as the Nsaids that we'll talk about next. But it does have some degree of anti-inflammatory effect. So problems with it. First one, it is the number one cause of liver toxicity in most countries, including the USA. People dying of liver toxicity. I think Bruce Lee, I know this is maybe slightly contested, but Bruce Lee is supposed to have died from taking this and having liver failure. That was the idea, which is kind of shocking just because he was considered at the time to be one of the strongest, most, but not in a kind of, I guess, pure bulk way, but in a kind of, grace and harmony and all that way. So the idea that he'd be taken out by by Tylenol was quite shocking to everyone, which is why some people contest it. But whether it's true in his case or not, the idea stands that someone could seem to be fine and yet they could die from taking this. Now, the other problem is generally, the problem to me is that the difference between lethal dose and recommended dose is not that big. That's a challenge. So the lethal dose is generally considered to be 7 to 10 grams in a day, which is 7 to 10,000 milligrams. You want to convert it into milligrams. Whereas the maximum recommended dose, I'm just looking at now on the NHS, which is the British Medical Authority guidelines, 8 500 milligram tablets in 24 hours. So that's 4 grams, which is kind of crazy. And, so the argument is, maybe in many cases you would have less than that. But still, like that's not a big difference, right?
It's not for something that you think is really safe. It's over the counter. Yeah.
So that one kind of blows my mind. Now the thing that they're talking about in the news recently, in relation to pregnant women taking it, which we can get into if we have time, maybe we have to do another episode, is that it does deplete glutathione. So the main danger of the other Nsaids, or what are normally considered Nsaids, ibuprofen and the rest, is more the gut lining, stomach, intestines and stuff like that. With paracetamol is more the liver. And so that's because the body has to use glutathione to process and deal with it. And now, to go back to my, as I said, maybe slightly paranoid friends, one paracetamol once is very likely to cause a problem. Like it will deplete glutathione a little bit, unless the body's severely struggling, it will bounce right back, no problem. But if you taking even half of what's recommended as the maximum level on a regular daily basis, or even if it's intermittently, if it's every 2 weeks out of the month or something like that, it is over time depleting those reserves of glutathione more and more. So what does that mean? At the very least, it means general oxidative stress. And if you happen to have high levels of some other toxin, which requires glutathione to process it, like some other heavy metals or mycotoxins or all the stuff we normally talk about, then the body is going to have much less left to deal with those other toxins. So a lot of the time when they're measuring the safety of things, they're doing it based on theory and studies. Now, the studies, fair enough, like they're seeing what that representative population can handle. But with theory, the problem I usually have with the theory that they use is it's usually, well, a healthy person can blah, blah, blah. And it's like, sure, it's true. A healthy person whose glutathione levels are optimal because they're not really struggling with any kind of oxidative damage and any significant toxicity could probably honestly take 2 to 4 grams a day for quite a while and then stop and the glutathione would bounce back. But what about the person whose glutathione is already struggling? And this is where it goes back again to cost of test to me. I personally wouldn't want someone to take paracetamol until I check their glutathione status. The only problem is, I'm looking, where I'm living currently, I don't even see where I can test my glutathione, even though lots of other tests are available. I know in the UK, in the US, talking about like $100 or something like that, and having to do a venous blood draw. This is, for most people, it's just out of reach. And so I'd say, before, well, what about if you've been taking it for several years and you're watching this and you're now worried it might be low? I would consider testing it. I would say it would be worthwhile to find out if it has been depleted, especially if you're planning to be pregnant, but just in general, that glutathione is really important. It also does deplete sulfate. It does deplete taurine, which are both sulfurous, substances. Glutathione is also so basically, it's the transsulfuration glutathione pathway that your body mainly uses to detoxify the Tylenol itself. And if that pathway is already blocked and struggling with you, then this is a risky thing to do. And I have tended to avoid it, and maybe this is why. Maybe I on some intuitional level, I knew because my lead and everything that this is not a particularly good thing for me. But I think there are more people in that category than realize it. Even though, as I said, you don't necessarily have to believe that one pill is going to be dangerous. On the other hand, probably a lot more people than realize it. They shouldn't be having it. It can also lead to gastrointestinal excessive permeability and bleeding. It's not as common as with the other Nsaids, ibuprofen, etc., but it does happen. It can lead to hypertension. I think probably through the model of depleting those sulfurous detoxification agents, although that's not proven. It can lead to kidney injury. And yeah, as I said earlier, overdose is the number one cause of acute liver failure in most so-called developed countries. Doesn't have a big effect on the hormones, but in terms of the immune system, it does suppress a lot of what we talked about earlier, that immediate response. And so, while in some cases you might want to suppress that, it also means that your body's going to be less able to deal with an infectious agent optimally. Not, it's not suppressing the immune system that much, but it's not going to have an optimal level of response because it is suppressed by some degree. So, that's something that matters as well to me. Oh yeah, and then talking about glutathione, I'm talking about lead and mycotoxins. What about alcohol, right? Alcohol is a very common glutathione depleter used by a bunch of different people. And so, even though the safe level in the packet is recommended 4 grams a day, when I dug into it, the research shows more that less than 3 grams a day, and that's for an average size adult. If you are an adult, but maybe you only weigh 100 pounds, I would scale that down proportionately, for instance. Obviously the size of it's not as if you're 300 pounds, your liver is 3 times the size, and if you're 100 pounds, but it's also true that it's not exactly the same size. Generally the organs scale with the size of the body to some degree. So I actually think that, especially if you're not using it occasionally, less than 2 grams a day is more of a safe maximum level. And don't have alcohol at the same time. Don't have any drugs or substances which deplete the liver at the same time, which is a lot of them, honestly. So it's worth checking that if you're not sure with Google or AI. And then N-acetylcysteine is often actually used in the case of overdose. N-acetylcysteine used by supplement users and functional medicine people, all the rest of it, nutritionists, as a glutathione precursor is the number one thing to use in a medical situation if a person is overdosed. So N-acetylcysteine is definitely worth considering supplementing with as well if you're concerned about this at all. N-acetylcysteine is cheap and easily available and stable. Glutathione would technically be more effective because it's directly the thing, but often it's not very effective and stable in capsule form. So you have to kind of have it intravenously or injected, or you have to have it in a liposomal form, and you have to make sure it's fresh, so it's not years old. So that's why N-acetylcysteine is usually preferred. Not because it's better than glutathione, but just because it's more likely to be kind of stable and work and be absorbed by your body.
Wow, I had no idea. I mean, but now when you talk about it with the glutathione pathway and what they were saying about the liver damage and all that, it makes sense, and now I understand it. So then, it's also, so you do have people then that have been on a night out, and the next day they've got a bit of a hangover. That, let me just take some paracetamol, let me take some Tylenol, and that knock-on effect.
While their body's still struggling with aldehydes, which is why they're hungover. Yeah, absolutely. It's a terrible idea. As are a lot of things that human beings do. Again, I don't want to overstate it, but
No.
it's significant. And like 500 people in the US every year roughly die from it. There's a lot more people who are having really bad reactions that are not all the way to dying, and then there's a hell of a lot more people who are having suboptimal outcomes as a result of doing it. Probably, I would guess, in the realm of millions, and it's just not focused on.
No, right. Well said. So, right, what is next on our painkiller category list?
Nsaids, so ibuprofen, naproxen, celecoxib, and even the one that I was on recently, what's it called? Nimesulide. They're all in this category. And so, and aspirin is usually in this category as well. Sorry. So they are all COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors, so reducing prostaglandins, generally, as I said, more powerfully than paracetamol. And so that's why they're known as anti-inflammatories specifically. So some of them, like celecoxib, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, they are more COX-2 rather than COX-1, which reduces the impact. So basically, prostaglandins are important. They're generally considered like bad from a medical point of view because of their leading to inflammation. But one of the other things that they do is they help protect the lining of the digestive tract with this kind of mucosal layer. And this is especially important in the stomach, although it's true for the whole digestive tract, because the stomach is full of acid. And so if that protective layer of mucus is too thin in the stomach specifically, and in the digestive tract in general, because the stomach acid to some degree does go, especially into the duodenum, it can burn up the stomach acid that's there, and the bile potentially can burn a hole in that lining and lead to things like ulcers, stomach ulcers, duodenal ulcers, and then gastric bleeding, which can even lead to death. So, this is a different mechanism, but it's also really important. So this is really the main downside with these ones. And as I said, some of the ones that honestly I've never used, but which I just listed, they have less of that GI risk, but to be equally effective as painkillers, by hitting COX-2 more, they increase your cardiovascular risk. So there you go. Like, there's always something with all these. There's, I've watched those movies and TV shows about magic. They're like, there's always a price to pay, and it's like, it's how it feels to me with painkillers. Like, there's always a price. Nothing is ever risk or price free when it comes to these avoiding pain agents. So Yeah, we talked about that. I'm just going through the dangers here. Cardiovascular events, less common than gastrointestinal events. So yeah, the stats on it, your risk of ulcers and bleeding in the digestive tract increases by something like 4 to 8 times when you use Nsaids. So given that, you know, stomach ulcers are not as common as they used to be since we discovered H. pylori, but they're still pretty common, and it's not like something really rare. And it's very unpleasant and very painful and life-threatening. And so to increase your risk by that much, I would say is quite a big deal. Just like the paracetamol, secondarily, also risk of kidney injury. If you have chronic kidney disease, then generally it's recommended not to have them because they do tax the kidneys. So they're both a stress on the kidneys, but NSAIDs, I believe, more so. They can also delay healing of things like the bones and tendons. Why might that be? Because of what we talked about, because that inflammatory process is part of the healing process. Now, in my stats here, it says bone and tendon healing. I don't see why it's not delays all healing, frankly, for the exact same reason and mechanism that I described, because inflammation is an essential part of the healing process. And so when you block the inflammatory process, you block the healing process. For that reason, I've seen some people say, for instance, that after intense exercise or even after injury, it could be a bad idea to do extreme cold exposure for the same thing. It's not a chemical that's stressing your kidneys or anything, but still, it's really blocking the inflammatory response. And that may not be a good thing when it comes to healing. That's the idea, and recovering. Ditto people trying to put on muscle. If you go to the gym and do a workout where you're tearing muscle fibers, it's going to create an inflammatory reaction to some degree. When you're breaking down muscle fibers, again, there's a bunch of cells that are going to be damaged, and your immune system is going to respond. When you block that immune response, when you block the inflammation, even with something pretty innocuous like cold exposure, you may be reducing the body's ability to heal, and then, in that specific context, grow muscle. I say may, this is still being debated, but I wouldn't be surprised. It can make hypertension worse, just like paracetamol. So that's the kind of usual warnings. So the nutrients, it can interfere with folate, which can be a really big deal if we think about methylation in general and homocysteine and all of that kind of stuff. If folate is not being absorbed properly and not being processed properly by the body, then you're more likely to have raised homocysteine. If you're more likely to have raised homocysteine, you're more likely to die of heart disease, have Alzheimer's disease, all of these issues again. So it's a bigger deal than it may seem. And iron malabsorption. Some could actually argue this is a benefit. And I know that's why Ray Peat, for instance, talks about using aspirin, which is in this category, judiciously to actually reduce iron absorption. So if you're trying to reduce iron absorption, if you have hemochromatosis, for instance, or if you just believe that iron is the root cause of disease, like actually a lot of our guests, past and I believe future, believe, then you may actually see that as a benefit. But certainly if you're worried about not getting enough iron, that would be something to worry about. In terms of hormones, blunts post-exercise anabolic response. So what does that mean? Less healing, less muscle growth. It may actually even lower testosterone in people who are using it a lot, studies have shown. So that's interesting as well. And then, we talked about this, the immune systems. Everything I said about the immune system and paracetamol is more the case with NSAIDs because they have more of an inflammatory effect, more of an interference with healing, more of an interference with the natural, probably appropriate response to infectious agents. So the other thing, if you're taking it for a long time, you probably should be on a PPI, which is a proton pump inhibitor. So it's one of those things, you take a medication, but you have to take another medication for that side effect, and then that has a side effect that you then have to take another medication for, and this is where you can quickly get into a chain of problems. Again, almost certainly not if you just take one once, if you're at least reasonably healthy, but this is more like with habitual use. And this is where when I was on Nemesol, because it's such a powerful NSAID, much stronger than ibuprofen, I also took a PPI with it, just because I didn't want to risk, getting a bleeding ulcer at the same time as this dry socket issue. And so, yeah, black box warning are about avoid if you have chronic kidney disease, avoid if you have heart failure. Yeah, it's dangerous in excess, and it's very dangerous in certain situations.
Okay. Again, we did kind of know, or at least I did in my family, a little bit about if you are going to take one of these, you should take it with food because of the stomach and the acids and things like that. But again, it's also good to know, like what you just said about, post-workout. Somebody may be doing a workout and like, oh, I'm a bit tender. Let me take an anti-inflammatory. But it could have the opposite effect, as you just were saying, that it may, inhibit you from actually putting on the muscle that you're wanting to put on.
Yeah, or even if you're not trying to put on muscle, I don't know, if you just run a marathon, it'll block the healing process. It'll slow down and inhibit the healing process.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, well, good to know. And so then moving on to our next category.
Opioids. I think everyone knows that these are bad, including the people taking them. But let's just talk about the mechanism anyway. I think because it's interesting. So it's it agonizes, so hits the opioid receptors or endorphin receptors in the body. Unsurprisingly, that's how they work. So what does that mean? It reduces the perception of pain rather than pain itself. I personally, the worst pain I ever had, I've talked about it a few times, it's where I had an ankle swollen to 3 times the size. They never really worked out the cause. But anyway, they put me on morphine. I found it to be really ineffective for the pain. Like it put me in a kind of dream-like state where I was slightly like able to kind of see visions and stuff when I closed my eyes. But I did not find it very effective for the pain at all, compared to even the natural thing, which I'll talk about later if we have time. And I have talked about before, so I'm not teasing. So, it's like, but some people love it. So other mechanisms it works by, it reduces glutamate, which is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the body, and it increases dopamine, which is the primary, not pleasurable. We talked about this before, but like if we're talking about what is it to feel good, most people are going to talk about either endorphins or dopamine. I think primarily endorphins, depending on which endorphin, being kind of bliss, stroke, ecstasy, stroke, euphoria, something like that. I'd say it would be the category of, but a kind of hazy euphoria in the case of opioids. Whereas dopamine is that kind of feeling like you are God. I think that's like the fundamental thing when you're on a very large amount of dopamine is you feel invincible. You feel like the best. You have zero self-esteem issues when you have high levels of dopamine. And so the combination of those two, I can see why it's a very addictive thing, because it's it's definitely more opioids than dopamine, but it is both. And the reduction of glutamate, is relaxing, but it's very reducing in glutamate. So that's, like with the strong opioids like fentanyl or whatever, you see people like zombies, like, walking around, like they just have way too little excitation in their system. Tramadol specifically also inhibits serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake, so it increases serotonin and norepinephrine in a similar way to the way a lot of antidepressants do as well. So drawbacks, obviously dependence and addiction, tolerance that we've talked about before. You've got to keep taking more. But, some of the things that really put me off, one of them is constipation. Like something like 90% of users have constipation. It's extremely common. And so what does that mean? Well, that's, I often refer to that as phase 3 detoxification. So it's not hitting glutathione, which is phase 2. It's hitting, like, actually getting the waste out of the body, processed by the liver, which is phase 3, which is arguably even worse, and as well as being uncomfortable and all the rest of it. It leads to nausea, often lack of appetite, respiratory depression. It reduces testosterone a lot long term, up to 70%. It stops the adrenal glands working as well. So again, it's kind of zombie-like state. People usually adrenals work no matter what. Like no matter how compromised someone is in myriad other ways. Like if there's an emergency, they're adrenal glands start pumping out adrenaline and they will have a surge of energy. That is blocked with this, which is life-threateningly bad in a bunch of different scenarios, whether it's someone coming at you with a knife or whether it's like your blood sugar dropping too low or like any of these kind of situations. You need your adrenals to be able to surge, and it stops that happening. Long-term immune suppression. So more generalized than only blocking inflammation, just the whole immune system stops basically being able to work correctly. So that's not good. And obviously very large amounts of overdoses and poisoning deaths, way more than paracetamol, admittedly. Which is why generally it's acknowledged as being dangerous. But we got to remember, this is a time sensitive thing. In the 1920s, doctors were talking about how safe and effective heroin was. Literally heroin, not morphine or anything else. You could go and buy it in a bottle from the pharmacist. No big deal. 10 years ago, doctors were talking about how safe, oxycodone and all these other things were, and not addictive. And they were wrong 100 years ago, they were wrong 10 years ago, and they're probably wrong about a bunch of stuff now. This is what I want you to remember. Like, maybe 100 years ago, no one's even alive back then, they didn't know back then, blah, blah, blah. Well, what about 10 years ago? What's the excuse for that, Probably most of those practitioners are still practicing right now. They've been given different guidelines, and some people say they're actually under-prescribing opioids because, they're so kind of afraid after what happened. I think that's debatable, but the point is, there was that reaction. Basically, doctors are human, and human beings have the ability to get caught up in fads and dogmas and kind of consensus thinking, right? If everyone else is doing it, it must be fine. And then who is creating the consensus? Of often cynical, power or profit focused people who, don't necessarily care about the long-term consequences of what they're doing. And I think that probably sums up the opioid crisis in a nutshell. And, it's a big deal. Anyway, off my soapbox, get to specifics. What nutrients does it deplete? B12 is one of them. B12 is very important. I guess all nutrients are important, but the reason I often focus on that one especially is because unlike most nutrient deficiencies, if you just catch it and give the person very large amounts, they'll recover and they're fine. With B12, once it gets beyond a certain level, it's impossible to replenish it. So that's always why I think B12, there should be a big deal made about it. And I think why it's one of the few nutrients that medical doctors actually test fairly routinely. Both for energy and nervous system function. Magnesium as well. I couldn't find research if that's related to the constipation effect, but I wouldn't be surprised. And we've got to remember, magnesium's important for a lot more things than just regular bowel movements. So magnesium's, one of the most important nutrients in the body, myriad different uses. And so anything that blocks the absorption of that, I think, is a big deal. It blocks the gonadotropin releasing hormone, basically the hormone the most upstream for the sex hormones for both men and women, which ends up in low testosterone and low estrogen. And it really suppresses the NK cells, natural killer cells specifically, and increases the risk of all kinds of infections. That's, mainstream science, like study supported. What I didn't see mainstream, but which I think is the case, NK cells are really important for preventing the C word. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there is that correlation between use of those things and, increased levels of the C word, even compared to before when it's already very high. So it's a big deal. Probably this is the one where I least need to say that. I think everyone already knows it's a big deal. But there you go. Now you know what some of the reasons why. I'm sure there's more. If you've ever said something like, I've tried everything to lose weight and nothing works, then this message is for you. Hi, I'm Owen Robinson here from the Rejuvenate podcast. Most people think that difficulty losing weight is about willpower or calories or exercise, and the truth is it's not. It's usually one or more of 5 hormonal imbalances that are blocking you losing weight. That's why Dr. Miriam Mikitsky and I created the Hormetics Weight Optimization System, a simple quiz that pinpoints your type, then matches you to the exact formula you need. Right now, we're launching the leptin balance formula, and this is specifically formulated by Dr. Miriam and I, exactly for people who have this leptin resistance, which makes it very difficult for them to feel satiated by food. It's packed with African mango, Ceylon cinnamon, and alpha-lipoic acid, ingredients shown in numerous scientific studies to help your brain finally hear the "I'm full, I'm satiated" signal, so you can stop thinking about food. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/leptin, order now, and you'll be invited to join our clinical study the moment you check out. There's no cost for this, and you can track exactly how well it works for you, and you can get 20% off now by using code REJUVENATE at checkout. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/leptin and use code REJUVENATE for 20% off now. You deserve to feel satiated again.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few documentaries out there, or not even just documentaries on Netflix about opioids and what has happened in the United States with the use of them. So if you have any other ideas, just go check those out as well.
So corticosteroids, basically it's prednisone, which is basically just cortisol, and then there's kind of different modified versions of it. And so cortisol is a natural hormone, which obviously is a stress hormone. We've just recorded an episode on it yesterday. I'm not sure. It'll probably come out before this. And I've done episodes talking about cortisol before. But yeah, it is also a very powerful anti-inflammatory. In fact, that was one of the things that Wim Hof, who we mentioned earlier, that's one of the ways that his system is so powerfully anti-inflammatory, because he gives techniques which temporarily really spike cortisol, like cold exposure and his breathing technique. But it is also just used as a drug. You can get it as a cream is the most common, though it's also injected. Often it's localized, so if you have damage in a specific area, and I think it is more commonly used in that way, but the most common than for general pain and inflammation, but the most common use is for autoimmunity, and what they call autoimmunity. Again, the immune system undoubtedly sometimes attacks its own tissues. So let's just say that's what autoimmunity is. And so in that case, to stop your immune system attacking its own tissues, cortisol is the most effective thing. Whether it is a medication that your doctor gives you, or whether it's something that you spike by diving into a bucket of ice water, in both cases, it is very effective at reducing that. And from what I see, the people who do really well with like a Wim Hof method are the people who have that what they call autoimmune tendency. That's the most slam dunk. I was told that this thing I've got is incurable and it's totally gone away. All these amazing testimonials and stories and case studies and stuff. That's the one that's the most easy to understand, would be because cortisol is so effective at that. So it does deplete nutrients. It depletes calcium. It depletes vitamin D. It depletes magnesium. It depletes potassium. All of which are very important. If you take it as a drug, which is really what we're talking about here, it's going to mess with your whole endocrine system, specifically the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain to adrenal glands part of your endocrine system. It also is a big contributor to insulin resistance, as we talked about in the cortisol episode. Insulin resistance often then correlates with leptin resistance, which we talked about. It also often correlates with excess estrogen and estrogen dominance. So cortisol, now again, I'm not saying cold baths are necessarily bad, especially for some people, but I am saying if you take a medication which is cortisol and massively raises your levels of blood cortisol, and you're taking it every day for months, this is classically known to make you gain weight. And in fact, when you hear someone talk about steroid weight gain, they're talking about one or two types. They're either talking about anabolic steroids and they're talking about muscle, or they're talking about corticosteroids and they're talking about fat. Those are really the two types of steroid weight gain, both of which are common in that if you use anabolic steroids, you'll probably put on muscle even if you don't even do any weight training. And if you use corticosteroids, you'll probably put on fat even if you don't eat any extra food. It's just the way it works. Hormones are powerful. So this is a big deal. It also suppresses the immune system. Surprise, surprise. That's what it's for. I mean, autoimmunity. So, and is that a good thing? If your immune system's attacking its own tissues, you could say yes, at least short term, right, until you work out what's going on. But is it a good thing in terms of your body's ability to deal with infections? No. So again, look, if I had a really bad autoimmune condition, like, I don't know, lupus or something, would I take prednisone? Honestly, probably, but I would be doing it temporarily until I worked out what the hell is going on and resolved it ASAP, because it has a laundry list of bad side effects that you want to avoid. And again, kind of like opioids, it's pretty well known, these bad side effects, which is why it's usually recommended with caution. Now, that's for like painkiller purposes. Smaller amount of cortisol, often used by kind of more alternative practitioners who focus on hormonal health. We talked about it a bit, Chrissy, in the episode about thyroid. Sometimes you give someone a bit of cortisol first if their cortisol is too low. So that's a bit of a different case. But in this episode, I'm really talking about the amounts given for painkilling and autoimmunity. Actually, let's do ketamine another time, because I'm currently investigating other things in that class. So I might want to do an episode on that. Like agmatine sulfate and stuff, as a teaser for you nootropic experts out there. Let's get to cannabinoids, the last one in the category. So we kind of started talking about them because we talked about anandamine being raised by paracetamol. Let's end with this because, as I said, I took some Nsaids this time. Last time I had really bad pain, I didn't because none of them worked except for one which made my heart race too much. And so I was stuck with, well, what am I going to do? And really the only thing I had left was CBD. And I'm actually surprised at how effective CBD is, with a couple of caveats. And probably the number one caveat is you need to have a lot of it for it to work. And actually, ironically, the pure CBD isolate doesn't work very well. It does have to have a little bit, at least, of the other cannabinoids and really the terpenes with it. So I say that right at the beginning because I know when I talk about CBD, a lot of people might switch off straight away, like, oh, I tried that, it doesn't really work. And so I just want to say it can work, but you have to have the right amount of the right kind. So now I said that, let's go back to explaining it. So cannabinoids, generally, there's two main CBD receptors in the body, CB1 and CB2. CB1 is the kind of get high one that's more classically associated with cannabis. So this is pain reducing, analgesic. It is also euphoria stimulating, and it is anti-nausea or hunger promoting. And so generally that's hit by THC, which is considered the psychoactive part of the cannabis plant. But these are, again, natural receptors that we have in our body, and we have natural endocannabinoids which also hit that CB1 receptor, which is why some people can get high without taking anything through various meditation techniques or, intense exercise, cold exposure. All of those have also been shown to hit the CB1 receptor. CB2 is the anti-inflammatory one without any psychoactive properties. And so CB2 is more the turning up the regulatory part of the immune system that we talked about. Both the cannabinoid system and the endorphin system are surprisingly important for the immune system, surprising to most people, I think, that these things that are generally associated with getting high or feeling good are actually really important for the immune system to function well. But we did talk about that already in an episode where we talked about chronic pain and inflammation, and we talked about things like low-dose naltrexone, so that's a different episode. We're talking here a bit more about acute pain, although we're talking about both. I think that's the distinction with this episode, and painkillers specifically. So CBD is a substance that hits the CB2 receptors most, although it isn't directly. It gets a bit complicated, but basically the effect it has overall is much more CB2. It's a anti-inflammatory compound. It is also a sedative to some degree, but there's no psychoactive, euphoric, or kind of a habit forming element to it. Basically, it doesn't raise dopamine. Anything that raises dopamine can easily become addictive, including even activities like gambling or whatever. CBD doesn't increase dopamine, so therefore doesn't have that addictive tendency. It so is not psychoactive that actually CBD can reduce the psychoactive property of other things. So if you've taken too much THC, for instance, you can actually, and you're freaking out, you can, in theory, actually reduce the impact it's having on you by taking a large amount of CBD to kind of balance it out. So there are a bunch of drawbacks with THC. This is very controversial, I know, and again, I rarely see anyone as defensive of their substance of choice than cannabis users with cannabis. So I probably should do another episode that really gets into that if you would like to hear my take on it. But as much as I am wary of THC, I am quite a fan of CBD, at least within the right context, for a few different reasons. I'll just touch on a couple of them here. I will say for THC, I mentioned my father-in-law who's basically dying of end-stage cancer. Am I against that person having THC? Absolutely not. And anyone in a position where they have pain that they cannot resolve, it is arguably a better option than most other options. The level of THC deaths, for instance, is non-existent. Now, the things that you could blame on THC related, again, this is where it gets a bit controversial, but the direct deaths are zero, which is you cannot say for Paracetomol, Nsaids, opioids, any of the other things that we've talked about, right? And so if it is effective, there's definitely an argument to be made for it. It does increase, both types of endocannabinoids increase appetite, which is useful, again, with some people, but can be a problem with others. We've talked about how being overweight is a major risk factor for all kinds of diseases and health issues. So usually there's more to being overweight than eating too much, but it can be a factor, and something that makes you eat too much, is not ideal, potentially. There is some evidence that THC lowers testosterone. There is more robust evidence that THC increases estrogen. So that's an issue that that is definitely not ideal from a weight point of view, but also from a health or a well-being point of view. Depending on how you're taking it, smoking in general smoke is full of a bunch of different carcinogens and pro-oxidants, things that are going to stress the body. If you are vaping, then there's not the smoke, but then there's all the other chemicals potentially in the vape liquid. And if you use it orally, then if it's pure and uncontaminated, you are avoiding all of that, but it's not as effective, meaning you need quite high doses, which gets back to that point I made earlier. The good news of CBD is even at very high doses, it's pretty safe. So I saw a study, for instance, of someone using of a bunch of people, several dozen people, using 0.5 gram a day for months who had MS, which is one of those, it considered to be an unresolvable severe pain condition. Zero negative side effects in any of the dimensions measured. So, and that's pretty good, right? Like if you compare it to paracetamol and all the other things we just talked about. The only side effect that I have never seen listed anywhere, but which I don't like, is I find it as drying. So I find it gives, and I suppose this is talked about like dry mouth for people who smoke cannabis, but even just orally using CBD oil, I found it to be drying. But I do not know for sure if it's the CBD or if it's one of the terpenes in there, which is having that effect. So that's probably actually the number one reason I don't use it, or I use it very rarely, but I use all painkillers very rarely. But if I were to consider a painkiller, this would be the top of my list personally, in most cases.
That is a really good rundown, a good list, because as you've said, you are a fan of CBD, not necessarily THC. So it does have some of those really good medicinal properties, as you have mentioned. So this has been quite extensive, and I know there's other categories out there. So if people are interested in some other categories, do you think we should have them put them in the comment section? They can ask us to do a more in-depth one for some other things if they're interested.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, we haven't got to muscle relaxants, gabapentinoids, SNRIs, TCAs, or ketamine and its analogs yet. So I skipped all those because they're more obscure. But we could talk about that. We could talk more about the endocannabinoid system and endorphin system and how it relates to especially chronic pain and inflammation, and things that are effective for it, like low dose naltrexone. So if you would like an episode on that, let us know.
Fantastic. As Owen, I really do appreciate when you do this, because it's not only about the education, but it's also about putting that education into our listeners' hands so that they can make a much more informed decision. So thank you for, the research and going into it so in-depthly. I really appreciate that. Anything else before?
And so,
oh, sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
before we finish, Chrissy, I know you were interested in this episode from a personal point of view. Will you make any changes to your choices or amount of use or anything as a result of this? And if so, what are they? I'm curious what conclusions you've come to.
Yeah, I mean, as with you, I've from a while ago, I've been limiting my use of these over-the-counters, but now I'll take a quick pause before, if I do decide I want to use something, and really look and see, okay, where is this coming from? And is it going to be a little bit more of a detrimental effect? Because instead of me just limiting it until the pain got so bad that I'm like, oh gosh, I actually have to take something. Now I will ask myself the question before, as you said, to really investigate, okay, where is this pain coming from? Is there something else I can potentially do to support it, move beyond it, identify it without having to take this? And then if it gets to the point, what I do know is how I can support my body with maybe some more nutrients as it's moving through, especially if I'm going to have that paracetamol or the acetaminophen to really make sure that my glutathione pathway is working, and then the Nsaids as well. But yeah, it has helped me take pause and ask that question.
I would say the thing that surprised me most in the research is paracetamol is actually not as bad as I thought it was at if it is used occasionally, unless the person really is depleted in glutathione, like we talked about, which most people are not that depleted. It's really the long-term use that is really dangerous, which, well, as I said, I had more of a negative view of it, so that was interesting. Just to give one example of an alternative before we finish, Chrissy, headaches. I know a lot of people talk with headaches that really it's dehydration, but what I've actually found in practice, which I've never heard anyone else talk about, is I'm surprised how often people don't know the difference between a headache and a sinus ache, and how often I've been able to help someone resolve their headache just by often using a nose spray thing. And the issue is, and this is because I had this, I would describe it as dry sinuses. I had it for years. And I've realized eventually most people would call this a headache because it is a pain in in my head. But I didn't associate it with that because I'd always had these sinus issues. And I was like, I wonder how many other people are calling sinus issues a headache. And it turns out it's quite a lot. So if your headache is at the front of your head, not the back, or even, the top, just try doing a sinus spray, whether it's a Sudafed or, I prefer the xylitol spray things. And you may be surprised that, within 10, 20 minutes, it's gone. And you don't have to take something that's, going to deplete your liver and cause GI bleeding and all the rest of it. You can literally take some water with a tiny bit of xylitol and shove it in your nose. So, I mean, I know every case is different and there's lots of things going, but it can be as simple as that. And it often is. And it just takes a bit of, we talked about the thing about people are in a zombie-like state and NPCs and all the rest of it. To me, that's an example of it. The quality I'm seeing more and more is just a lack of curiosity. It's that defines this trance-like state. And it's just not asking the question, if I have a headache, why do I have a headache? Or, if my ankle hurts, why does my ankle hurt? If my whatever, just asking why and kind of persisting until you find out why. And sometimes it's a really complicated, difficult situation, like it's ended up being for me in my gastrointestinal issues. But sometimes it's a really simple thing, oh, my head hurts because it's dry, because I'm in a dry room and I've dried out for whatever reason. I can just spray a bit of water up there and I'm fine again. It can be really simple.
Yeah, you make a really valid point there. It can be really simple. So, I mean, that is one of the things where, just looking at it, identifying it, and seeing what you can possibly do. Yeah, no, absolutely. But as always, Owen, thank you. Thank you for bringing this to our attention and to our lovely listeners. And also, listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We always know that your time is so precious, and we are so grateful that you decide to spend it with us. So please remember that supporting our sponsors helps support this podcast. Remember to hit that bell icon so you don't miss an episode, and we will see you next time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode, and one of the ones I'd recommend is just here, if you want to click there, or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.